Mechanical group sets can be found on loads of new bikes, from entry level all the way up to high-end super bikes. Up until about a decade ago, mechanical group sets were the only group sets available. Even today though, brands are still investing lots of time and money into developing their mechanical group sets further to ensure that you've got precise and smooth shifting. In this video, we're going to explain to you how to install and set up a mechanical group set so you've got nice crisp gears to enjoy out on the road. If you've not installed a mechanical group set before, it can feel like a bit of a daunting task. But once you understand the basics, it's actually fairly straightforward. So let's run through some of the tools and equipment you're going to need to make a start. The tools you're going to need are a selection of Allen keys, a torque wrench, cassette tool, chain tool and pliers, cable cutters, side cutters, a Holotech bottom bracket tool, grease, and the relevant bottom bracket tool for your bike. So what are the parts you're going to need? You're of course going to need your brand new group set. However, today we're going to be rebuilding this bike using the parts that we've removed from it before. The parts you're going to need are shifters, a front derailleur, rear derailleur, chain set, cassette, a chain, the brakes, rim brake or disc brake, inner cables, outer cables, and of course some cable ends. So let's make a start, but first off, let's assume that you've got your bike in a similar state to what we've got here. Fortunately enough today, we've got the brake hoses already installed, cable liners running through the frame to help us guide the cables through, and of course the forks and headset already installed. If you're unsure how to install any of these components, we've got plenty of videos detailing those, so it's worth pausing this video, going to check those out, and then revisiting this back, ready to carry on. But let's make a start first and install our first component, which is going to be the cassette onto the rear wheel, before we can then move on to installing some of the components onto the frame. To fit the cassette onto the wheel, we're first going to need to find the spline on the free hub, which is the smallest. That's going to enable us to line up the cassette and slide that onto there. If your cassette is already pre-installed with the small plastic piece that it comes fitted with, you can actually keep that in place, guide it onto the cassette free hub body, and then the cassette will slide all the way on in one go. If you're unfortunate enough to not have that, you're going to have to line up the small splines on each sprocket and guide them into place. It's a good idea before you install the cassette just to put a little bit of grease onto the free hub body to help stop that seizing on there. Having located the smaller spline on the free hub, we can take our cassette and then carefully guide it down and line the splines up with any luck, carefully trying to guide them into place. As you can see, this one has moved slightly where I've been moving it around. Then take the lock ring, again lining up the small spline with the small spline here, place, and finishing off with the lock ring, taking care not to cross thread it. With the cassette installed onto the wheel, we can take our cassette tool, install it into the wheel, and torque it up to about 35 to 40 Newton meters. Although if you haven't got a torque wrench capable of that, give it a good old go with the cassette tool and it'll be plenty tight enough. Having installed the cassette onto the wheel, we can now move onto the bike and start to install some of the components to the bike, such as the rear derailleur, the front derailleur. But on this bike, for example, we need to install the cables because these are routed internally. We can't fit the bottom bracket or the handlebars until we've got the cables routed all the way through, ready to install the rest of the components. So first off, let's make a start on the derailleurs and then move on to the cables. When installing the rear derailleur, it's always good practice to apply a little bit of grease onto the threads of the bolt here, where it attaches to the bike. The same can be said for any other components we install on the bike. It's always a good idea and good practice to install a bit of grease onto the threads, and come later on down the line when you maybe have to remove some components, it'll make life a lot easier. As we're installing the rear derailleur onto the bike, it's important to carefully line the threads up, and as we're doing it up, ensure we line up the tab on the back of the derailleur with the tab on the derailleur hanger before going in to do it up using our torque wrench, and I believe that's at 5 Newton meters. Next up, we can install the front derailleur, and it's a very similar process to the rear derailleur. We've got a little bit of grease on the thread, take the component, install it next to the front derailleur hanger, take a bolt and washer, carefully guide that into place, thread that up by hand, making sure that the silver washer here sits correctly on the face of the hanger. And at this stage of the process, we're only going to need to do this hands tight before we can then later on install the bottom bracket and the chain set. As I mentioned earlier, this frame has got internally routed cables, and this stage of the process is the ideal time to install those through. Fortunately enough, we've got these cable liners to help us guide the cables through, but if you haven't, you could use an internal routed cable kit to help you out. Once we've got the cables in place, we can move on to installing the bottom bracket and chain set. We're going to be installing new outer cables for the gears today, and luckily enough for me, I've got the old outers to use to cut to length. But if you don't have old outers to use as a guide, it's a good idea to make sure the length you cut is a little bit longer than you require, so once you've guided it through the frame, you've got a bit of excess to play with that you can always cut a bit shorter later in the process. When cutting the outer cable, it's a great idea to have a good quality set of cable cutters. This will ensure that when you're cutting your new outer cable, it doesn't crush the ends and make it difficult later on down the line to thread the inner cable all the way through. So a little bit of extra somewhere here. Take our cable cutters, line them up, and then one good smooth action. Nice clean cut on the end. Now we're going to repeat the process for the rear derailleur outer cable. So again, same as we did for the front, take the cable all the way through, guide it to the correct length and use our cable cutters to ensure we've got a nice clean cut ready to guide them through the frame. Taking our freshly cut cables, we'll find the shorter one, which is this one. This is obviously for the front derailleur, and then we'll make a start guiding that through the frame. As I mentioned earlier, this bike has got internally routed cables, and this is where the internal routing cable kit comes in handy. But if your bike's got external cables, you're obviously not going to need this, and your life's going to be a little bit easier installing the cables. But to make our life easy, we're going to use this kit to guide the cable all the way through. What we're going to do here is take the end of the internal routing kit, guide that down into this sleeve that is installed into the frame, and then once that's secured in there, we'll guide it all the way through, and that'll mean we've got the cable routed inside the frame, and then we'll install our outer cable and guide it all the way back through, so that what's left inside the frame is the outer cable that we can leave in place. Having guided the internal cable routing kit through the frame, we can then install this into our outer cable, like so, and then that'll enable us to guide it all the way back through the frame and be left with what we want to leave behind, which is the outer cable for the front derailleur. Having installed the front derailleur outer cable down and in through the frame, it's important to remember to use this small piece of foam sleeve which will stop the outer cable rattling against your frame. It'll probably drive you a little bit crazy if you leave that step out. Having guided the front derailleur cable all the way through and slotted that in place, ready for the inner cable to be guided in later on, we can repeat exactly the same process but for the rear derailleur, using our cable kit to guide the outer all the way through, ready to leave in place. Having guided the internal routing cable all the way through, we've attached it to the outer cable, and then we can guide it all the way back through so that we're left with the outer cable installed in the frame, running from the front all the way down to where the rear derailleur is, and we can put an end on it and attach it to the rear derailleur. Having guided the outer cable through, and with a nice clean cut end on it, we can now apply the cable end to the cable, like so, and then guide that into the rear derailleur at the barrel adjuster here. And again, that's sat there, ready for the inner cable to guide through later on. Having completed that stage of the process, we can install the handlebars back on the bike, like so, holding the forks to guide them in place. With the handlebars and stem back on, we can install the top cap and then look to do all the bolts up correctly. You can now use your torque wrench to do the stem bolts up, making sure you've got the handlebars as straight as you can get them now. But not to worry, if they're not quite straight at the end of the process, you can always re-straighten them then. So then we'll torque them up, using the bolt, torquing the bolts up nice and evenly, one side to the other. Do this side, working our way across to that one. This is at 5 Newton meters or 6 on this bike. Having torqued the stem bolts up correctly, we can move on to our next job, which is installing the shifters onto the handlebars. These, just a simple process. Got the clamps here, which we guide down over the bottom of the handlebars, like so. Guide these on, and then we can move them up carefully to about this point here, because what we're trying to do is when the bike is level, the shifters will be about level 2. And we can take our 5mm Allen key here, take that, And we'll just loosely fit them for now because we can always reposition them and torque them up correctly later on. So that's enough to hold it in place. And then we can repeat the process for the right hand shifter, again doing it up loosely to hold it in place. Later on down the line we can always level them off and tighten them up correctly. At this stage of the process is the ideal time to install the bottom bracket. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there are many different standards and types of bottom brackets that your bike might have. On ours, this is a press fit, but if you're unsure how to install the bottom bracket that you've got, we've got plenty of videos detailing how to do that, so it's worth checking those out first. Having correctly installed your bottom bracket, we can move on to installing the cranks. Again, if you're unsure how to do this, we've got plenty of videos detailing the different types of cranks and how to fit them, so go ahead and check those out too. Having installed the bottom bracket and cranks, we can go ahead and line up our front derailleur, and this was the reason we left it fairly loose early on. This will enable us to just back the bolt off slightly, like so, and then we can line it up not only for the height here to make sure it's 2 to 3 millimeters away from the top of the teeth, but also to make sure it's sat at the right angle at the back here to make sure it's parallel with the chain rings. Once we've got it parallel and the height is set correctly, we can use our torque wrench to set that to 5 Newton meters and keep it in place. With the majority of the components installed onto the bike, we can move on to thinking about installing the chain. But before we do that, let's install the wheels so we can then get the chain on after that. And then we'll just pop the front one in too. Moving on to installing the chain. Fortunately enough for me, this chain is already the correct length. But if you're installing a brand new chain and you need to make it the correct length, the best and most tried and tested method is to take your chain, install it over the largest sprocket on the back wheel. So we'll guide the chain through, putting it onto the largest sprocket on the cassette, all the way round the big chain ring. Guide that round, missing out the rear derailleur. And then once we take this, we can move it together here, and then it's a case of adding 2 links like so where the chain meets, and that'll give you the correct length chain 9 times out of 10. Having installed nearly all of the components of your group set, one of the final items to install are our inner cables. We can go back, starting at the front, install these through, and that'll enable us to finish the cabling on the bike before moving on to finally setting up and adjusting the gears to ensure they work correctly too. If you remember earlier, I said about cutting the outer cables a little bit longer than required, and now we're working back at the front of the bike. This is the time to cut them down to the length you need. So you can take the outer cable, guide it the way it's going to sit around the bars, and then decide how much you're going to need to trim off the ends to get the cable to sit nice and flush where you can tidy it up with the handlebars. And on these, I think we're going to need to take a good 20 mil or so off, and we can put the cable ends on. Use our cutters to get a nice clean finish on that too. So with a nice clean cut end on the outer cable, we can take our specific cable end that goes into the shifter, and you can tell this is the one that goes into the shifter because it's got this little piece on the end here, and also it's got this little ridge here to guide into the corresponding ridge down here on the shifter. Once we've got that in place, we can carefully pull this little cover out from here, which will enable us to have a little bit of better access to guide the cable through the shifter itself. So that's out of the way like so. This cable end can go on the end here. And then we can get our inner cable and look to guide it from the outside through, and it'll poke out here ready to go through the outer cable. Having taken your new cable out of the packet, this is the end that stays in the shifter, and this is the end that we guide through the shifter and guide through the outer cable to the mechs. With the cable guided through the shifter, we can take the end and then guide the cable into the outer, like so, and then guide that all the way down carefully until the cable pokes out down by the front derailleur. Perfect. Then we can get hold of it down here, pull that through. Having guided the inner cable most of the way through, now we can move to the front again and guide the rest of the cable through and make sure we get the outer cable to sit correctly into the shifter. So through that bit there. And then that's where we line up the little slot on the end of the cable into the slot on the shifter and sit that in place. And then we can reinstall this little plastic cover, clip that in there, And what you would then do is tape the cables nice and tidy underneath the handlebars like so. Perfect. Having installed the cables nice and tidily for the front derailleur, we can repeat exactly the same process for the cable here that runs all the way to the rear derailleur. That way we can get the inner cable inserted, tidied up at the front, and then we can move down to the mechs themselves to look to install the cables and then of course set them up correctly too. So we've got the inner cables routed through and we've tidied the cables up at the front to make it a little bit nice and tidy. We might as well move on to the rear derailleur now and make a start setting that up. Before we can attach the inner cable to the rear derailleur, we're going to have to first set the limit screws. These are going to limit where the rear derailleur stop points are for down by the outside of the bike, and also the inner edge to stop the rear derailleur going into the spokes and just creating a bit of a mess which you don't want. These are adjusted at the back of the bike, labelled high and low relative to which one they're adjusting, and they're adjusted using a 2mm Allen key like so. With the bike in the smallest sprocket, we can look to set the high limit screw. This is going to make sure that the top pulley wheel is in line with the smallest sprocket and is adjusted by turning the high limit screw like so to ensure that the pulley wheel is in line with the sprocket to make sure the limit is set correctly. Next up is the low limit screw, and to adjust this we need to manually push the rear derailleur all the way up into the largest sprocket here. So this is to make sure the top pulley wheel is now in line with the largest sprocket on the top. And this is adjusted in the same process as the high limit screw, but using the low limit screw as it's labelled on the derailleur and adjusting to turn it to ensure that the pulley wheel is nicely in line with the sprocket to make sure the derailleur can't travel further than it's meant to and end up in the spokes of your wheel. Having correctly set the high and low limit screws, we can move on to installing the cable down and through the cable pinch bolt. It's always good practice here to make sure that the barrel adjuster is wound all the way in to enable us to make some minor adjustments to the indexing on the next step of the process. With the cable guided through the pinch bolt, we can apply some tension with our free hand to the cable to remove any slack. Take our 4mm Allen key and then just do that up like so, and then we can go back in with our torque wrench and do that to 4 or 5 Newton meters. Still working on the rear derailleur, we should now be able to shift up into the largest sprocket. The shifting might not be quite accurate yet, but it should be enough to shift into the largest sprocket. And we can look to set the B limit screw. This is located at the back of the mech here and adjusted with a 2mm Allen key. And what the B limit does is adjust the gap here between the top pulley wheel and the largest sprocket. And what we're trying to do is create a 5mm gap between the largest sprocket and the teeth on the upper pulley wheel. Okay, so still working on the rear derailleur. We've set our limit screws, we've set the B limit screw, so we can move on to setting the indexing to fine tune the gears to make sure they shift correctly. The indexing is adjusted using the barrel adjuster here. And to check this, we quite simply need to change gear and see what happens. So pedal the bike, shift up into the next gear. Now that's actually shifted perfectly, but if when changing gear you find that the rear derailleur doesn't move far enough to change into the next sprocket, you're going to have to add some tension to the cable using the barrel adjuster, and you can turn this anti-clockwise to add more tension. If when you change gear you find that the rear derailleur overshifts, it almost shifts across 2 gears, you're going to need to remove some tension from the cable, again using the barrel adjuster, but this time turning it clockwise to remove some tension. So having correctly set the derailleur and making it operate correctly, we can go on to our final step of the process, which is of course to cut the excess cable from the back here, normally leaving about 30 to 40mm. Cut that like so. We can now apply the nice little cable end onto this to make sure the cable doesn't fray. And we can take our side cutters like here, just to crimp that on there to make sure the cable end isn't going to fly off, leaving us with a messy cable. And our final component to set up is of course the front derailleur, and this follows a very similar process to the rear derailleur. We need to set the high and low limit screws, and we already positioned it correctly earlier. The high and low limit screws are adjusted using a 2mm Allen key, very similar process to the rear derailleur, and just adjust them in here. We're first going to adjust the low limit screw on the front derailleur, and to set this we're going to need the chain on the smallest chainring and on the largest sprocket on the back. And adjusting this, we're trying to make sure that the inner face of the chain is not touching the inner face of the derailleur and causing it to rub. It's best adjusted with about a millimetre gap or so, but as long as it's close enough but doesn't rub, that'll be perfect. To set the high limit screw, we're going to need the chain on the smallest sprocket at the back and the big chainring on the front. And by holding the front derailleur manually with your hand in place, you can go in with your 2mm Allen key, and we'll adjust it to make sure we've got a nice small gap between the outer edge of the chain and the outer face of the front derailleur to make sure it's not going to rub. About a millimetre or so will be perfect. As long as it's close enough to not rub, that'll be fine. Okay, so we've set the high and low limit screws. Now we can look to move on to attaching the cable through the pinch bolt on the front derailleur. Now if your derailleur is brand new, you're going to have needed to remove this small little cover, which would normally sit on here like so, just to cover up the cable pinch bolt, but I'd already removed that anyway. So set that to the side and don't forget to clip it on later. To install the cable through the pinch bolt, we're obviously going to have to undo it first using our 4mm Allen key to make that nice and loose. And it's also good practice to take a 2mm Allen key and loosen off this small adjusting screw here, which serves a similar purpose to the barrel adjuster does on the rear derailleur, and that's going to allow us to make some of those fine adjustments once the cable is installed. To guide the cable through the pinch bolt, we can get it to go through the groove at the back, guide it round and under the pinch bolt, and then guide it round to the side like that, before we can take the rest of the cable and loop it all the way around the back, like so. Now we can pull that nice and tight. Having correctly guided the cable through the pinch bolt and round the front derailleur, we can take our free hand, apply a little bit of tension to the inner cable, and then take our 4mm Allen key, guide that in, and do the cable pinch bolt up correctly 4 Nm afterwards with your torque wrench. Having correctly secured the inner cable through the pinch bolt, we can take our cable cutters, and we need to cut off in a similar process to we did with the rear derailleur, about 30 to 40mm remaining of inner cable. And before we put the cable end on, we're going to need to take our little plastic cover that we've got and slide that over the cable, because this actually guides and holds it in place, enabling us to put the cable end on and leave it nice and tidy. Our final step for setting up the front derailleur is actually to set the cable tension correctly, and this is done using this small adjuster that I mentioned earlier, using our 2mm Allen key. And as it happens, I've already checked this and I do need to add some cable tension to it. So I'll take our 2mm, just pop that in there, a couple of turns to add a bit of tension onto that, and then I can go ahead and recheck to see if the front derailleur operates as it should. So there you have it, start to finish, how to install a mechanical group set. Of course, I had the luxury of not needing to install the brake components, but if this is the next step of the process for you, it's worth checking out the other videos we've got detailing that. It's also worth noting that if after a couple of rides you're finding your gears aren't quite shifting as crisp and precisely as they were to start with, you should be able to make these adjustments using the barrel adjuster on the rear derailleur and the small adjuster we pointed out on the front derailleur. Of course, I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you have, please do give it a thumbs up, and if you've got any questions, why not get them down in the comments section down below.